This is Jerry Barrett talking. Today's date is April 29th, 1986. I'm interviewing Captain Randy Babbitt in the ALPA headquarters, or the ALPA building in Washington, D.C. Captain Babbitt, if you would you start by talking a little bit about your background with Eastern and with ALPA?
Surely. I started with Eastern in 1966, based originally in Washington. I've been with them to date. Currently a DC-9 captain based in Washington. I've flown a variety of airplanes with them over the years. My ALPA background goes back to approximately 1974 when I began to do committee work. I was a local council representative in 1975. Went on to negotiating committee work in 1976. Chaired the ALPA Eastern Pilots Negotiating Committee from 1978 through 1980. Also involved with national ALPA work, committee being Collective Bargaining Committee, which I chaired from 1980 to 1984. In 1984, I was accepted the job of Executive Administrator of ALPA, working for Captain Duffy, the job I currently hold now. Side piece, just from a legacy point of view, my father went to work with Eastern in 1935, and I believe has held over the course of years just about every job you can have in ALPA at one time, some of them all at once. I think there was a period of time in the early 60s when he was local council chairman, master executive council chairman, negotiating committee chairman, and a regional vice president all at the same time. So my background on ALPA does go back a ways.
Okay.
Brings you up.
Very good. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the pilots and the and Eastern, kind of a historic sweep from your perspective?
In my tenure, more particularly the tenure that would interact with the presence of Frank Borman. Starting about 1975, Frank Borman was elected by the board to be president, fall of 75, if I recall. And Eastern was in difficult times and had some financial problems. And the pilots, at his urging, leapfrogged some raises, made some minor concessions here and there. And probably over the years, that has been the story of the relationship between Frank Borman and the pilots. They were always fairly receptive to him with requests regarding the future. There was always an unspoken rapport between the two that something gave him that one little extra bit of credibility, the fact that he was a pilot. Mm-hmm. And I don't think he ever missed any opportunities to play that to its maximum value, and I don't say that disparagingly. I think the circumstances, the events of Eastern, the inability to come to grips with some other costs, the people who were receptive were the pilots. Others were not as receptive, and the fact that the company would go back to the known help area, which was the pilots, I think strained the relationship in time. They were constantly asked to do more than their counterparts in the industry in terms of concessions and so forth. And while I'm not being critical of other labor groups, the animosities that were probably more honestly felt between the groups were vented at the company for not doing more. And a case in point was, I believe, the fall of '83 when the machinists threatened to strike. I think Colonel Borman lost a great deal of credibility at that point. He indicated that he had had enough. We agreed that he should have had enough. It had been a good 8 years of appeasement to them, concessions from others, and appeasement to the IM. And he stated vocally all around the system that this time they were going to have to get in line with the rest of the labor groups. and he took his cards right up to the last hand and then folded, and lost a great deal of credibility. People were very upset with him. Rightfully or wrongfully, it set him back enormously with the pilots. From that point on, there was a certain unjustified lack of faith, and even worse, probably open skepticism that if he would recommend it, then that in itself was reason not to do it. If he'd said nothing, they would have probably come up with better ideas than the fact that he would suggest things. And I express these as a feeling that I gather from the group, not necessarily personal opinions. The pilots put blinders on to facts for some of that time, and lived on emotion rather than the factual condition of the company and so forth. Going more broadly over all of the labor groups, my feeling was that Charlie Bryan probably didn't have much of a rapport with Colonel Borman, and that lack of rapport wasn't just the standard labor management relationship. It was, in my opinion, deeper than that, and it became pretty intense personal competition between those two, sponsored primarily, in my observation, from Charlie Bryan. Although I have to admit I never sat down and heard his side of it, I certainly heard enough of the other side. And I don't know that a lot of pilots would have felt sympathy with Charlie Bryan's position. There was a lot of antagonism, a lot of strings being pulled. It was more of a three-way battle than a two-way battle. It wasn't the traditional labor management. It was more pilots against the machinists who were against the company, and the pilots felt everybody was against them, and I'm sure each group in that tripart felt they were the odd one out. So that gives you the kind of the overview leading up to the events of the sale.
Okay.
That healthy skepticism was certainly in place and there when at all times it didn't need to be or shouldn't have been.
Let me ask you a couple of specific questions then.
Sure.
What was ALPA's view of, particularly with respect to Eastern, of the deregulation? Were you surprised by the impact that it had? Did you anticipate that? Or what was it?
We tried to, as a national organization, anticipate. Going back, I can remember the high degree of skepticism that was felt by the pilots when the former president, J.J. O'Donnell, brought forward a plan in 1976. He sought to do more nationwide type bargaining, put some national threads through all of our contracts. We had for 45 years been completely single unit bargaining.
Yeah.
And O'Donnell sought to change that, and the pilots then, it was not only not well received, it was rejected out of hand, that was ridiculous, that we had done very well bargaining autonomously, and that would continue ad infinitum, which in fact it didn't. So there was some wisdom that was re-emphasized in every national collective bargaining committee report that ALPA did establish, by the way, in 1980. They established a national collective bargaining committee, and I was either a member of or the chair of that committee from 1980 to 84. Every report, every interim report ever written suggested that we had to find ways to break down these autonomous barriers. So while there wasn't any surprise from the top, the implementation of those changes has been slow to come about. As probably the case with anything regarding a change of policy or legislation, you don't bring the change about until the pain is felt, and then it's usually too late. The medicine always follows the disease, so in this case the impact had to be felt. The downward cycles of bargaining and the period of late 80s through 83 were not good years for ALPA. There was the full impact of deregulation. There was available financing for upstart airlines. The companies we're feeling the effects of a national recession. All of these things just exacerbated the problem, and they were tough years for bargaining. Our contracts, I think we would have been happy to stay flat, and in fact, we lost ground in many, many areas. Overall, what we've tried to do to correct the effects is take away some of the autonomous nature. In the past, we felt, this is an oversimplification, but if we could take each contract and improve upon it in each bargaining round, and even a piece negotiated at Pocono might have an effect, and you could then turn to it in negotiations with other carriers and say, well, look, they even do this at Pocono. You know, we would like to have it in our contract. Those days are gone because of no more regulation, and they've been replaced with corporate arguments that say, look, even this airline gave 5%. Why can't you? So we're forced to go, and we're always negotiating and defending ourselves from the lowest common denominator instead of to the highest. So. So just a change in our structure has come over us. We've evolved. We have, like all evolution, it's slow, but we have evolved, taken steps to strengthen ourselves, to make ourselves somewhat more responsive so we can react a little more quickly. Long ways from being home, but the trend is here.
It would still be accurate to say, though, that individual airlines operate pretty much.
Yes.
What I mean is the ALPA equivalent at each airline operates relatively independently even yet.
That's absolutely correct. A good case in point, we have only policy. We have no binding other than things that are set forth in our Constitution. All of our policies and so forth regarding bargaining are just that, policies. We have, as an example, a no strike clause, yet we have 8 carriers that have accepted one. The one we're seeing now with some chagrin in the industry, and I say chagrin from other pilot groups, is TWA. Carl Icahn had been briefed on what the IM had in their contract and found out it had a no strike clause. So when he bargained with the other units, namely the flight attendants and the pilots, he thought that he should have one of those in each unit. And in an effort to avoid a takeover by what they viewed as a hostile company, not in their best interest, to avoid that, they agreed to something that conflicts with our policy and signed a no strike clause, or no secondary, actually. It's no supporting. So there are variances, and yes, we are, to be quite specific, we remain very autonomous. We have some implied policies that we do pretty well. Another good example would be B scales. We're allowing reductions through the 5th year, but parity is a must, 6 years and beyond. They would go back to the incumbent scales. And the theory being that in time these pop-up carriers will too have to mature and pay going wages. So to compete, we give the companies an early advantage with a little bit lower entry pay. But we're insisting on parity. There are airlines that don't have parity in the 6th year by a variety of language changes, and some of them, the United case is open to arbitration should they not come to an agreement in the future negotiations. So there are a lot of variances even from our policy.
Frank Borman has been quoted at various places referring to deregulation as being anti-union. Do you believe that to be the case?
I'm probably more responsible for that quote being around than I'd care to admit. I happened to read in an aviation seminar, page 187 or some obscure document, and he was making a speech, and at the time I think they were looking for some concessions or something, and I caught a piece, his comment, I think I can quote it almost directly, that the Deregulation Act of 1978 was the greatest single anti-labor legislation passed in this country. And so in some newsletter or something I saw that this was included just to give the boys a little bit of an idea how their president felt about deregulation, because obviously it was very unpopular with the pilots. You find out in time when you're in an elected office or an appointed office that getting people charged up to do something is one thing. Uncharging them is very, very difficult. And sometimes I regret ever informing them things like that, because they when times change, you say, oh, we're all friends now. They don't forget that. Well, you're the guy that sent me the quote that said this or this. So that quote has been widely used, and I think it carried with it. I mean, taken somewhat out of context, it was a statement. It was an acknowledgement. There was nothing subjective. I mean, whether he approved or disapproved wasn't in there. He just made the statement. And I think his statement was probably not too far off the mark. But no, I never thought for a second that Frank Borman was truly anti-labor in the sense of out to break labor. Quite the contrary. I think you could make a pretty good case that Frank Borman, one of his flat spots, and we all have them, one of his flaws of management was that if anything, he was probably too paternalistic. The organized labor might the rank and file might find exception to that, but I think I could draw you some pretty good cases in the late 70s, early 80s, 81, when the recession was in full force. Eastern should have furloughed. They should have cut back. They should have gotten rid of 500 pilots. They should have gotten rid of 5,000 employees and pulled in like everyone else did. But we kept this policy of full employment and instead turned to the employees for some concessions in order to do that. I think that was done for the betterment or the well-being of most of the employees. If you all take a dime off a dollar instead of taking 10% of you and putting you out of work, what's the difference? And the employees felt that what they wanted was full employment and full paychecks. Something that was not there. Just,
They voted for both, right?
Yeah, they voted for both. I want the chocolates and the bonbons.
Okay. One other event that has made the airline industry a kind of a bumpy one recent years was the I've lost the year now. I guess '81 when the PATCO work stoppage took place and the replacement and so forth. Can you talk a little bit about that and its impact?
Yeah, I think some of the airlines were particularly hurt, especially those poised for expansion. More than one airline executive has had the theory stuffed in his head that he can fly his way out of trouble. I think Frank Borman has been quoted many times as saying, "We'll fly this airline out of trouble." The ex-president of Braniff, that was one of his theories too. And it's a great idea as long as there's people in the airplane when you're flying out of trouble. Lacking those people, you can get yourself in a lot of trouble, as Braniff did. And I think what happened specifically at Eastern was they were poised for this expansion, and they felt that they could at least keep their head above water by flying the fleet X amount of hours. But when PATCO came about, all of a sudden we were very severely restricted. You were restricted to the amount of flights you could operate at key airports, and you in effect re-regulated the airline to a much, much lower revenue block hour production than was even dreamed of. So as a result, Eastern found itself with a fairly new fleet of airplanes that it intended to fly the socks off of. They figured they could get the break-evens down low enough by flying the fleet and going to some innovative things. And suddenly they found that ability taken away from them. And again, Borman probably took the heat. Had there been no PATCO, things might have been very different. The company might have not lost the monies that it lost in that period of time if they were able to fly the fleet. It was so uncertain that pilots, you may or may not be familiar with the way they typically bid, but marketing And the Flight Operations Department blend together the schedules months in advance. And pilots bid often 2 months ahead of the time they actually fly a flight. They know what they're going to be doing. Right now, for example, the guys already know what they're going to be doing a month from now. Their schedules are all laid out, and they know what days they'll be working. And during PATCO, it was a day-to-day operation, literally. And you can imagine the nightmare of that. Every day, you would call in, all 4,000 pilots would call in and find out what trips were going to be flown, and then literally bid on them on a day-to-day basis. Just chaos, and not just, you know, Eastern. This chaos was going on everywhere. So the manpower that could have been thinking about other things was devoted to day-to-day operation of the airline instead of long-range type planning. You know, all of these little pieces. I can make the analogy and have that Eastern's rocky road from the 80s, you know, or 1980 to 1986, is much like an aircraft accident or a car accident. There's never any one thing. Geez, my rear view mirror was broken, and it was raining, you know, and I, you know, didn't have my normal shoes on, and, you know, it was not my car. When you put them all together, you had an accident. And you take any one piece out, probably wouldn't have had an accident. And Eastern's much the same way. If there hadn't been a PATCO, you know, if fuel was $40 a barrel, and jet fuel was selling for $2 a gallon, that fleet of 757s would look pretty snappy right now. And people would be looking at how efficient the fuel burn was instead of how high the interest payments are. So.
Okay. That makes the point very well, that it's a whole combination of things,
Right.
kind of one after the other that
Dominant.
coalesced. Can you talk a little bit about their equipment? Because when people begin talking about the amount of debt that they had to manage, which was like pushing a big boulder up a hill, a lot of that had to do with their effort at getting a more modern fleet. And I would imagine from a pilot's point of view, you would like that. I mean, you'd rather fly new, big airplanes than old, small ones.
Right. Yeah. Pilots, in general, new aircraft bring them two things. You know, everybody wants the latest. They want the one with all the bells and whistles, the state-of-the-art technology. But the other thing increases in fleet size do for you is they bring about more pilots normally. I mean, if you buy more airplanes, you have to have more pilots. That means they hire. That makes your relative position improve on the seniority list.
Because the new hires come in at the bottom of the
hires come
seniority.
in at the bottom. So while everybody was all enamored with buying all these new airplanes, again, I'll go back to an analogy. It's like using the Visa card. You buy something, and you just really enjoy it, and then the bill comes in, and you kind of have forgotten the blush of, wasn't this wonderful when I bought this new thing? And the pilots enjoyed all this expansion and everything, but then when the realities of the company's debt problems were shown to them and they were asked to participate in solving it, I think I'd have to say that they might have overlooked the fact that they certainly had a very modern fleet now, and they were, sort of being asked to pay the piper, and yet they didn't even remember the piper anymore. I mean, these airplanes were here. They've forgotten that somebody was going to have to pay for them, and that may have been somewhat overlooked. Some very interesting studies were done later on. I saw one of our pilots who was an MBA and pretty shrewd with a pencil showed me one time pretty graphically that Eastern was spending something like $16,000 a day in capital cost to save $800 a day in fuel on a 757. Certainly going back to this multifaceted, multi-pieced problem, were not safe harbor leasing legislation or laws changed, it might have been a different ball game too. They took away the safe harbor leasing and left Eastern without the ability to sell off some of the tax advantages.
Can you say a little more about what that is? That
safe
concept?
harbor leasing? I'm not a tax expert, but my understanding, it allowed the company to take, Eastern was losing money, so there's no tax advantage, no income tax to offset for Eastern Airlines. So they were allowed to sell, and I'm not quite sure how the structure, whether they moved title to the aircraft in a capitalized lease arrangement, but I know it was very advantageous. You, in effect, could sell the tax losses to someone else who was profitable and could use them, and in return get something back, which was money. And that was, it certainly lessened the impact. It made it more attractive to a company who was only marginally profitable and could see the need for some capital expansion. The detriment to that in our current tax structure is, taking depreciation and things like that aren't going to do you any good unless you're making profits. So they would say, well, then why should we have a capital expansion? Why should we go out and buy a new fleet? And safe harbor leasing was an incentive to do that, and apparently it was too good an incentive, or they felt it was too big a loophole because it only lasted 2 years. And again, Eastern committed to a fair amount of expansion based on those laws that were taken away. So another piece of the rug gets pulled out from under it. So
some of the purchases that were made of aircraft were at the moment of the purchase were pretty attractive, the way they've been describing me. The Airbus, for instance, there was a desire on the part of that company to break into the U.S. market, and so they were not only need a new aircraft, but there was a strong inducement to do it. In addition to what you just referred to as the tax break. At the time that some of that was done, though, were the pilots saying this is too much, or were they mostly saying, great, more aircraft, better, good?
More aircraft, better. This is great. They were tickled. I know the Airbus was particularly attractive in its training advantage. They got, and I was on the Airbus pretty much at the start. I was a senior co-pilot and did my training in Toulouse. They literally gave Eastern 4 Airbuses for 6 months, trained the crews and said, try them out. Free airplane to fly up and down the East Coast for half a year. Very attractive. My recollection is correct, the first 50 or so crews that went on the Airbus were trained free. All expenses were taken care of. It was a marvelous arrangement. But as you have indicated, there was no clamor, oh, this is too much, you're going to come back, we can see this interest is going to hurt later on, and it'll rupture the company. If you went back and looked in the period of time between 1970 and 1975 in the airline industry, there's some interesting parallels. The actual pieces that changed were different, but the effects were the same. In 1970, both Eastern and American Airlines went into rather extensive fleet modernization programs. American buying DC-10s and Eastern buying L-1011s. And right in the midst of that came the fuel crisis. And suddenly you had these brand new monsters that went on the planning boards when kerosene was 22 cents a gallon, and now they were finding it was 50 and 70 cents a gallon, and that was just the beginning. This was a period of time when fleets were parked in Arizona, 707s lined up as far as you could see, because no one could afford to fly them. They lost all the planned revenues from those, and it took a great period of bootstrapping to get back on course, and some good years in the mid-70s, and some good profits to return. Unfortunately for Eastern, the same thing happened again. They went into this re-equipping phase a little ahead of some other airlines. And I'm not being critical. Somebody had to make the decision. Somebody had to make the projections of where fuel was going to be. Those projections were made, and somebody ultimately had to make the command decision. Yes, this is what we do. The decision was made, and it turned out to be a little off. I don't flaw anybody for having made the decision. Just perhaps the facts weren't all there, or something was overlooked, but no criticism on the actual decision. It had to be made, and the decision was made that fuel efficiency was the way to go. Just came about, with all these other pieces, the PATCO and some of the other things, and soaring interest rates, and bankers wanting to write loans with both hands, and here, take them, you can pay for them. Nobody putting that scrutiny on perhaps an overzealous expansion.
Certainly, at any point along the way, it would have been hard to predict that fuel costs would come down, isn't it? It's just,
right.
Once we all suffered, I mean, as individual consumers, as airlines.
Well, Eastern found itself very quickly, after committing to buying a fleet of 757s, up springs an airline like People Express, that instead of flying a $35 million airplane with 185 seats in it, Eastern finds competition from an airline that buys an old 727 and can be tourist configured to 177 seats for $3.5 million. 1/10 the capital cost, goes the same speed, goes to the same airports, burns a little more fuel per seat, but when fuel prices are coming down, it was not an effect at all. And in fact, the capital cost and the interest rates and so forth really hammered them. Put that along with the fact that Eastern would have in the left seat a pilot with 25 years of experience and had to be compensated accordingly, and in the right seat probably one with 10 or 15 years, again compensated accordingly. And so here they are flying an airplane that's 10 times more expensive, and every employee that's touching that airplane is probably receiving at least double what the competition is across the street, save the mechanics. It was really an uphill battle.
Yes,
A real uphill battle.
Almost overwhelming, isn't it?
Almost, yeah.
Almost overwhelming. Can you talk specifically about individual sets of negotiations in somewhat of a general way? Because I know you won't remember the specifics of each proposal, but say beginning with the early concessions that were made by the pilots at Eastern. Because as I understand it, it wasn't more broadly across other industries. We didn't hear about concessions until 80, 81, something like that. Whereas Eastern and the pilots were discussing those matters 76, as early as that.
Early.
Okay. Earlier than that. Okay.
Earlier than,
okay.
My first meeting that I went to as a representative, I remember it very clearly because I was impressionable, and I had gone from being just a regular old co-pilot and been on a small committee, and suddenly I find myself being summoned to a meeting at 10 Rockefeller Center. I'd never set foot in that building, and I was going to the top floor, and I was going to meet the president of the airline. I believe Floyd Hall was still the president then, and Frank Borman was there, and Bill Howard, and I was just, a very clear impression of that meeting that still exists in my mind. And the problem, Charlie Simons was still at Eastern at the time. The problem that we'd had in '74, I think the company had seen some rough times ahead, financial times, coming out of the fuel crisis and so forth. And they had asked for some concessions, and the pilots thought about them a while, but as it turned out, the company made a great deal of money. Their estimate was way off. They had predicted a $35 million loss, I think, and the company made over $100 million that year. So the pilots weren't, well, let's say they were fairly skeptical that, your numbers are so bad. You showed us your last year projection, and you missed it by $135 million, and that's quite a swing. So at that meeting, the company had requested, was referred to as I think it was the salary adjustment program, and it was commented that it was rather a poor choice of words because it made a terrible acronym. SAP was the acronym that came from the salary adjustment plan. But anyway, that was turned down. And very few things were turned down. Most of the times they were agreed to. And from that meeting, the company, it turned out, was fairly correct. The next time I really recall the concession request coming back around was 6 or 8 months later. Frank Borman had become the president, and the company had gotten itself into technical default on about a $75 million note. The pilots leapfrogged a couple of raises. We were due, I don't remember the exact dates, but something around April, we were due a percentage increase in salary, and they delayed that until the following November. Kept track of the difference and took warrants or profit sharing in the future for that amount of money that was deferred. They took another raise and moved it. Seems they leapfrogged 2. That was in '76. '77, I was a member of the negotiating committee, and we listened very clearly and closely to the company's concerns about deregulation should it come about, and they wanted some flexibility, and we gave them a lot of things. We went rather moderate in wage increases. They were minimal. A couple of or a 2-year contract, and it might have had a grand total of 7%. And this was in a period of pretty healthy inflation. We also gave the company the flexibility to expand their flying by agreeing to fly overtime several times a year, and the company had the option of calling most of them. We kept the option on one of them. 3 or 4 times a year the company could raise our cap by 5%, the cap being the maximum amount of hours we could fly. They could increase it. The whole idea was if they saw a market opportunity with this deregulation, they could jump on it. The types of things that got Eastern in trouble, and this should be pointed out, I personally took a lot of flack for ever agreeing to that with the company. And I had to spend a lot of time on road shows explaining to the pilots it was in their best interest because the company was A, only going to expand the airline with this, and B, take opportunities, and that would be better for us in the long run. The first time they used it, the first time they increased the cap, they used it to do training. And all my arguments went right in the sewer. And all I heard from that point on was, see, whatever you give them, they just take and throw away. They'll tell you anything to get it, and then once they've got it, they'll abuse it. So those types of things, if the company had announced they were going to fly one new route to Okeechobee, Florida, and therefore we're going to increase the cap, it would have, that's just communications, how things are perceived. The fact that they did the training, perhaps to take advantage of some increase in the future, was ignored. Some of their packaging was an error there. I think they could have put some frills around what they were trying to do and made us all look a little better, or at least let me know, or some of the people, hey, this is what we're going to do, and we could have told them, well, don't do it that way, for God's sakes. This will blow up in our face. So, going on '79, the company, we had agreed in '77 to the variable earnings plan, which I personally thought was a marvelous idea. I'd love to be able to take the full credit for dreaming it up, but I think that more rightfully belongs to Chuck Dyer, C.G. Dyer, who's one of our pilots up in Washington. Very bright lad. He's a Harvard MBA, and he came up with this scheme that we would agree on a negotiated rate of pay, but then we would only take home in our paychecks 96.5% of it. We would leave the other 3.5% as we called it the security net under Eastern. If the company's numbers proved profitable.
Is that you?
Not me.
Mine. It's okay. I don't know why it's doing that.
Okay. If the company were profitable, then we would return. The goal was 2%. If the company's gross revenues gave them a 2% profit, then they would return every bit of that. We would treat that monies, by the way, as if it was an expense. It was not an add-on later. Their books carried our salaries and so forth at 100%, but we only received 96.5%. So if the company had achieved its goal of a 2% profit, revenues over expenses, then everybody got all their money back. If it was less than 2%, they dipped into that fund. And remember that Eastern was at that time approaching a $1 billion a year annual payroll. So you're talking about a $35 million kitty that was sitting there. And the first year, we received a partial return. Year number 2, it was also negotiated if the company received a 3% or went over the goal, you not only got your 100% back, the 3.5 cap, but there was a formula to give you a bonus. And I believe it was 78 we received more than 100% pay for that year. Years thereafter, it bounced back. I think we got a partial one year. In the last 2 years, they received nothing back. But I still thought it was a tremendous idea in that it provided a great incentive. You were tied to the company, you as an employee, and directly. The more profitable the company was, the more likely you were to get more than they had agreed to pay you. I think, though, this was beginning to, in retrospect now, and I emphasize that, we probably should have agreed on one type of plan and stayed with it. One of the things that confused and disheartened the employees at Eastern was the constant changing of plans. You know, one year it was the salary adjustment plan, another year it was the variable earnings plan, then we had the wage investment plan, the stock program, you had the bond program, and I mean, you know, I told Colonel Borman one time that, you know, he inquired why the employees were so skeptical of him sometimes. This was when he was fairly new, and I said, geez, I've only been here at the time, you know, 14 years, but you're the 5th management I've seen. And I've been paid in green stamps, silver dollars. I've seen Operation Can Do, Bootstrap, you name it, I've seen it. I've seen the Floyd Hall movies. I've seen them all, and they've all been scams. Every one of them. These guys go through here like carpetbaggers. They take this place for everything it's worth, put on their platinum parachute, and take it out the window. And they live in luxury hereafter, and we're still, you know, sludging around dreaming up a new plan. Let's give them green stamps next year. I've got warrants, I've got stock, I've got bonds. So all of these things led to some degeneration of credibility. There was a famous Bill Howard memo that was circulated. Have you ever heard of this?
No, I've not. No.
I think it led to his termination. Bill Howard, the current president of Piedmont.
Piedmont, yes.
He was a VP at Eastern Personnel. And a confidential memo that he wrote to Colonel Borman spelled out in detail what the company needed to do was orchestrate a poor financial scenario and then take that scenario out on road shows and in front of the employees, and that would, and he may have even used the term, soften them up so that you'll be able to extract wage concessions from them. And what we need to do is make a horrible scenario and extract it from them for a long period of time, a long program. No Band-Aids, no year or two. You need to make this bad and lay it out. I have the memo if you'd care to see it sometime. When that went public, when that got out, that really, again, damaged credibility.
Oh, certainly. It certainly would.
But following the contract for the pilots in '79, which was an excellent agreement, the company had, in my eyes, lived up to their word and had negotiated the pilots back to a real place of dignity in the industry. It was a key point for me as negotiating committee chairman. You know, a certain pride amongst staying up with the industry and so forth, and the goal was Delta. It always is the goal. If you can negotiate a contract that gets near Delta, you win.
Okay.
And for the first time in 10 years, we actually passed the Delta hourly rate and monthly end rate by $40 for 1 month. And they went right on by us again, but that was all right. It gave a great feeling back to the pilots that we were back in the mainstream. Even though we still gave away 3.5%, you knew you could get it back if the company was profitable, and so we went forward. But when the recession started in 1980, The markets were getting hammered by new entrants. Yields started to deteriorate. The company again looked for concessions. They looked for profitability. Pilots are notoriously resistant to change. They would never make it as cockroaches because they can't evolve. They don't want anything to change. And I clearly remember one of our old guys retiring and telling the guys he'd enjoyed watching the 34 years of progress he'd seen at Eastern Airlines, but he wanted him to know that he'd fought every goddamn minute of it. So.
That's a very honest statement, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that sentiment sits deeper in them than a lot of us want to acknowledge, and with all of us, not just pilots. But the pilots began to resist. And another piece, I think the companies didn't do the greatest job in the world. I think we both were a little negligent. The companies didn't do the greatest job of acknowledging that these changing times were going to require some of these things, and they used the stick approach, to move them forward. And the pilots felt they were giving quite a bit. They were losing a lot of their traditional contractual frills, if you would.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we all could have done a little better job of educating. We could have sat down and perhaps come up with more innovative ways. And unions, quite honestly, often lose sight of the fact that while we have nothing to do 365 days a year but to plot against how to get things out of the company, they do have this minor diversion on the company side of running the airline. And they do have other things to do than meet with us constantly. I think the company was way too patient sometimes with the pilots, quite honestly. Way too tolerant of long, well, we'll cost this out and we'll take this delay and so forth. But that's all just, retrospective review. Concessions in 1983 was the first attempt at coalitions. The company really got into some trouble. It was the first time I had heard the word Chapter 11. And it was felt now, the skepticism, between things like the old Howard memo and watching things be eroded, the skepticism began to bubble up that they're capitalizing on Continental. If you recall, Continental went bankrupt in September of '83. And so, and Eastern was beginning by that fall to talk about it. We had made I'll back up and
Okay, we're back on.
referring to the pay cuts that were taken in '83. They're not crystal clear in my mind, but the scenario that I recall was that all three unions took a similar amount. We recorded that. I believe that was the wage investment program. And what we did was record the amount of money that represented the difference, as we had two types of pay. You had salary of record and compensation of record. Salary being a paper amount, which all benefits were computed on. The actual compensation was reduced from that, and that difference was recorded on paychecks. So that was another thing. You were constantly being reminded. It was like having a running total of everything you'd ever spent with your Visa card. You'd tear the damn thing up if you could see, oh my God, I've charged $4,000 last year. It's not too bad at $300 or $400 a month, but when you add them all up and see them, and that that every month you were reminded, and in some cases it was a sizable amount of money. For a mediocre seniority pilot, in the middle of the list, his concession was probably in excess of $10,000 to $12,000. Captains are often over $20,000 in that particular year.
And each month you'd be reminded of that by the stub you'd get in your
right on your stub. It showed the wage investment plan amount. I guess it had to be recorded, but it always seemed to me to be a constant rubbing of the wound. However, at the end of '83, you received bonds. If you had given up $5,000, then you got a $5,000 bond, which paid a nominal amount of interest, and sometime in the year 2006 or 10 or something, those bonds come due. And that was the year I mentioned earlier that the machinist, after joining the coalition, making the concession, when it came time to negotiate their basic agreement. Keep in mind the concession was a percentage reduction from salary of record. So someone could certainly, it didn't preclude you from negotiating upwards your salary of record, which is exactly what the machinists did. They went in and in effect, negotiated away their concession by agreeing or demanding that they receive increases that exceeded the concession. So in effect, they would be back at ground zero if they'd given up 13, 18%, somewhere in there. Whatever it was, they wanted that added on, so they, would zero out their concession, and they won. They challenged Borman. This I'd be very vague because I can operate only on rumors. Mm-hmm. But it was obvious that the company was gearing up to take them on in a strike posture. Seemingly millions, tens of millions of dollars were spent in preparation. Rumor had it supervisors were flown to outstations, and when the strike deadline got closer and closer, and I can only speculate, hearing road shows and hearing Colonel Borman speak, the inference was that the banks had abandoned him, and meaning that they had retracted their commitment to provide him financing through the strike period. With that, he had no choice but to concede and give the machinists their demands. 84 brought the real threat of bankruptcy for the first time to the pilots. The company began to openly talk about Chapter 11, and I guess what concerned a lot of us was watching Braniff and watching a few of the other ones. Those type of comments have a way of becoming self-fulfilling prophecies. You tell enough people long enough that you're going to go bankrupt, it really starts cutting into the ticket purchase, especially when you heard about people, holding the bag for $1,500 tickets on Continental to the Philippines that suddenly weren't worth the paper they were written on. The pilots again responded, and the whole airline responded, this time in coalition fashion, and we all took a uniform 18% pay cut, plus we all threw in productivity increases. Just a point in passing here, it was interesting to note that those productivity increases were agreed upon prospectively. They were not quantified, but in fact were agreed upon as percentages. We all agreed to come up with, I think the number was 5% increase in productivity. But we didn't say what the 5% was going to be. They were shallow. Quite honestly, they were damn shallow. The pilots said, well, one of the things we're going to do is save you fuel money. We'll fly more efficiently and save our 5%. And the machinists, I don't know what they did, but it was keeping the ramp cleaner or something like that. They were farces. They were not real quantifiable hard dollar values that you could put, into a contract, as far as I could see. Again, I was not on the MEC, nor was I on the negotiating committee. I was a casual observer of that process. But I don't think the company got quite out of that deal what they thought they were going to get. 85, a repeat scenario, and now the employees are beginning to get downright frustrated. Now the letters that come from the union say, well, we're back with the crisis and Christmas again. It's our annual Christmas review, and we're going to beach this thing again. The whale heads for the shore, and we're going to have to fend it off. And it was becoming almost commonplace. Now the Chapter 11 talk was, yeah, we heard that last year and the year before. It's going to be rough, and we'll get through it. And the classic crying of wolf. And I think what hurt this all leading up to 86 and the crisis in the winter, early spring of 86 was the fact that they had heard it so many times, and now it was almost like the employees were immune. And the company did themselves, in my opinion, a great disservice by going out and getting an outside opinion from a firm known as Avmark, which I could credibly call nothing beyond the trade-a-plane of the large aircraft industry. At least in this organization, they're not a terribly credible. I mean, they do a good service, and if you want to know a fleet value, fine, I would go to Avmark. But if I wanted to know how to run Eastern Airlines, I sure as hell wouldn't go to Avmark. I would get myself a high quality. Not that there's no quality there. It simply wasn't. That's not what they do for a living. You know, you wouldn't take your Porsche down to the grocery store to get it fixed. Why would you go to Avmark for management input about Eastern Airlines? And, they re-entered the word draconian into the everyday vocabulary by referring to all these measures that Eastern was going to have to take, and the whole thing just stunk of no credibility. It all just really reeked of an orchestrated scenario, going back to the Howard type memos that this was a setup. They have this outside, quote, consultant, unquote, that is going to, you know, forecast all these gloom and doom things. The company's now not talking so much Chapter 11, but Chapter 7, and openly talking to Chapter 7. But all the labor people, the attorneys that labor had hired, laughed at Chapter 7. They said there's no way that anybody would ever take a corporation this size. The last one that tried it was W.T. Grant, and the stockholder liability against the board, I mean the board liability, no one would ever try anything this crazy again. What they might try was a Chapter 11, a liquidating Chapter 11, put the airline in 11, fiend off the creditors, fly it, and sell off the equipment as you fly. But I don't care how well you're covered as an investor of Eastern with bonds or whatever, to put that whole fleet on the market all at once, there was no way they were going to get 20 cents on the dollar out of those airplanes. Braniff still has airplanes for sale, for heaven's sakes. So Eastern's marvelous fleet of L-1011s that they haven't been able to sell for 10 years certainly wasn't going to stir up any new market. All of these things put together put a haze of a lack of credibility, for anything else to say, over this whole process. And
you know, you're talking in the fall of '85.
Fall of '85. Yeah, winter. You know, the crossover between '85, '86, that January, when the company now, with all of this talk, we began to watch their revenue, and the company began to seriously lose money. This was becoming that classic self-fulfilling prophecy. All the talk, the advanced bookings began to deteriorate. Just piece by piece, you could see it happening. The employees were so totally frustrated. I think everybody in their heart wants to work for a successful company, whether it's a 3-man company or a 3 million man company. In Eastern's case, it's a 40,000 employee company. They wanted to work for a winner. They'd been losers for a long time, and yet it was always, the reason was always, it's labor cost, it's labor this, you're unproductive, you're this, you're that, and I think they got sick of hearing it. Now, whether it was, how much credibility you could put to it, one of the things that I can see for the pilots at Eastern was the easiest thing to compare would be a paycheck, and we have reams of pay comparisons and contractual comparisons available through ALPA, and the pilot pay at Eastern was not the top, not anymore. But what they didn't want to compare was the benefits, separate retirement plans, individually funded. The B plan that the pilots have is one of the best in the country. Their work rules are excellent and somewhat prohibitive. And yet the company was never able to show, and again, this is communications, where their true costs and where their problems were. They would just come in for well, just give us 20%, you keep all the other stuff. Well, now this guy has to go home and go play golf with a Delta pilot that lives next door and hear that he's getting, $2,000 a month less for doing what he sees as the same job. He could have very easily changed some of his work rules to be compatible with the Delta pilot and kept most of that $2,000. That was as much a mutual communication problem as anything. It all built up to a terrible lack of confidence and credibility from the union side to the company, and it showed itself in a lot of frustrating ways. I think a lot of the pilot reps who had been interested in the past were taking such a rap from their pilots, they chose not to run. I'm not going to be a rep. Why should I run and take all that abuse? They're blaming us for it. So people wouldn't take office. It left the people who did eventually go into the elected positions with a tough task. They were new. They weren't the seasoned reps of the past. As an example, they changed negotiating committees as if that would make the problem go away. I think they changed 3 times in a 30-day period. That's unheard of.
Oh my!
The company never knew who was going to be at the next meeting. There was no continuity, and rightfully no credibility that goes with people like that. You don't know who you're bargaining with, and they don't either. They're new to the game. So we were going through some tumultuous internal times. That it's almost a chicken and egg problem. Were they that way because the company had been doing poorly, or was the company doing poorly because the other way around? I think it was a combination. So you can see the stage was well set for a real tough time in February.
What would be the role of ALPA nationally with respect to those negotiations during that 3 or 4 month period there at the end of '85?
Okay, we provide, Alpha National provides contract administrators who are basically professional negotiators and in many cases lawyers as well. And they're versed with, usually not practicing attorneys in the sense that, bar and all of that. They tend to be labor lawyers, practice mostly limited to Railway Labor Act type law and negotiations and grievance type work within a contract. We would certainly counsel. We brought in the negotiating committee of Eastern, for example, was brought up here where they would meet. We do this typically and have been. This is one of the ways we're trying to break down some of our autonomy that I talked about earlier. We take the airlines, 3 or 4 of them that are heading into negotiations, and invite them up here to a conference and sit them down at a roundtable discussion with the latest 3 or 4 who have completed negotiations. Let's compare notes. Let's talk through this a little bit. Let's see where the companies are going. Where are we going? Where are we trying to be? Was there a lot of heat for a B scale? Was there this? Was there that? And so on. How did you combat it? What were the arguments you used? While we might know the answers to a lot of this here, it's good to hear it firsthand from a contemporary. And so the Eastern Committee was brought up into that loop. They had a pretty good feel where the industry was going. As time went on, I have particular rapport because of being an Eastern pilot, and I was involved, at least on the peripheral, for some of the negotiations. I did have some background. I understand the agreement pretty well. And these agreements, they're very mature, very sophisticated agreements. They're not, the Eastern Agreement is hundreds of pages long, and it's evolved. I mean, every little issue that comes up gets a side letter, and it gets incorporated in the agreement later, and they're very complex agreements. And it's not anything you just pick up and get yourself real familiar with in a week or two. So, plus there's certain unstated things that you're aware of that are in there. So Alpha National would be involved more from an advisory role. Sometimes the company would want to do something and be at odds who to contact, and we would play the conduit role. So call up here, and I would maybe put together a meeting if I could between somebody at the local level, and somebody at the company side. In the actual, as negotiations got closer and closer, the weekend the airline was sold, I went down and pretty much stayed with the master chairman throughout the process as best I could. I also, having some rapport with at least the flight attendant union, more so, and the fact that the machinist union wasn't in negotiations, there wasn't much to do for, running back and forth. But I did try and communicate some of what we were doing, that what our concerns were, what our goals were, in a protective sense.
Mm-hmm.
I shared with the flight attendant union,
Right.
for example, labor protective provisions. You know, what are we taking in the way of pay cuts? They felt that they were being hung out to dry. You know, that we would
The flight attendants did.
flight attendants, right?
Yeah.
That we would negotiate and tell them, you know, we were here, when in fact we had done nothing like that, and you know, they would agree to it. And then when they saw the light of day, we had in fact, you know, left them out on a pier somewhere. Well, it was my job to be the liaison and to keep that basically from happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you know, although it came to cause me some grief later, because the mystical night when the airline was sold, the flight attendants called us at 1:30 in the morning, and I spoke with the chair of the flight attendant negotiating committee. Excuse me, not the chair, Kathy Bailey. I don't believe was the chair. And she told me point blank that they had come to an agreement. And I advised the pilots of that in a session of the MEC, and that was clearly a point to help them make a decision. That the other union had made a decision.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, they hadn't. Well, I should clarify that. What had happened was they had gone into a caucus, the flight attendants had, and the company was in another room. And when I called, it just happened to be the moment that they had decided to accept the proposal the company had given them. So as far as they were concerned, they had a deal.
They had made an agreement. Okay.
What they didn't know was that at something like 1 o'clock in the morning, the company had left. They were no longer sitting in another caucus room. So when the flight attendants came out, there was no one to say, hey, we've got a deal. They were gone. And as far as the company was concerned, if they didn't take that offer, they went back to their table position. So they didn't have a deal. That came to haunt a lot of people later. And,
I can see that it would, yeah. And apparently the timing of that must have been that from corporate headquarters, they must have been called, their negotiator must have been called back from the hotel.
Was my understanding.
Because the sale had happened or was about to happen or something. Oh, yes.
And, well, there was an implied deadline at midnight by Texas Air Corp.
Yeah.
So...
That really put the pilots in an odd position.
Mm-hmm.
And then did you hear shortly after that the sale had taken place?
The pilots debated somewhat more, and there's my version of those events. I recalled that we were informed by the master chairman at about 2:50, 2:55 in the morning that the airline had been sold. Throughout the evening, though, the points had been made to both the flight attendants and the pilots of the MEC by legal counsel and national officers of ALPA, including President Duffy, that there were 3 possible scenarios in front of them. They would all come to an agreement for a concession, and life would go on.
Mm-hmm.
They wouldn't come to agreement, and would force one of 2 alternatives: either sell the airline or bankrupt the airline. And the order of priority would be that if no agreements, they would then take a snapshot of fairness opinions, compile those, and if the fairness opinions was worth more in bankruptcy than someone was willing to offer for the airline, they would take the best offer. If it was in someone's opinion that it was worth more bankrupt, then so be it. That's what they were going to do. And I think the board of directors was under considerable heat to make that move, to do something. I think they felt very exposed. Their fiduciary responsibilities or whatever were really beginning to haunt them, and justifiably so. Pretty crucial time right there.
Yeah, that was some high drama.
Yes.
That evening.
Yes.
That evening ended with the pilots actually having an agreement.
Mm-hmm.
Did it not?
Mm-hmm.
It
did.
At the end, was there a lot of sort of gnashing of teeth among the pilots over
Tremendous.
this?
Tremendous.
I imagine it was a hard.
Clearly divided. there was a lot of tension, not only on the negotiating committee. As with any organization, you have two sides. There were some that were very concerned to keep the company viable, to keep it alive, that taking a 20% pay cut would be better than risking the company going broke. And you may recall that the big point that the pilots were upset about, and the reason they had geared up so ferociously to prepare to strike, was the company had talked of just a horrible document. I mean, a major, they ceased to talk about a minor 20% pay cut. They began to talk in the 40% area, truly, in the words of Avmark, draconian measures, cutting pension plans, to just, chopping up, and things that had absolutely no financial value. One of the things that incensed the pilots, just absolutely lit their fuse, was the removal in a proposal, or a recommendation to remove the scope clause, which governs everything they do. We have a scope clause that says all flying done by Eastern Airlines will be done by the pilots of Eastern Airlines in an oversimplistic fashion. Company said, let's do away with that. And the question was, what the hell will that save you? You're going bankrupt and you want to farm out the flying to somebody? You show us the wisdom of where the dollar bills are and that. And so many of the things, changing procedures and changing how you could call a pilot into investigating. What the hell does that have to do with your financial problem? Show me how that's going to make you a buck. Quantify it. And they refused to do so. They continued to lay the same proposal on the table, and just, they really angered the pilots. With all of that leading up to that evening, though, the negotiating committee was split. There had been, for example, I had some input, and I have to admit that the hawks of that committee pretty much eliminated me from being a participant. I had recommended, and I had some language roughed out for them. It's like the old negotiator in You Never Dies, the Dalmatian, even the old one wants to go jump on the fire wagon when he hears the bells,
Right.
I just couldn't resist. There was things that concerned me, and I had some friends on the committee, and I had drawn up a couple of areas. One of the things I was very concerned with was that they would do a lot of preparations to avoid one thing and get themselves into trouble with another. So in their efforts, things like one of the proposals I had suggested to them was these pay cuts should be contingent on some things, on the airline not being sold. The labor protective provision should be effective if the airline is sold. This goes into effect, and so on. And while I guess I'll just take them quietly away with me and throw them away, I really wanted those things put in. Now they're a great subject of heartburn, but why in the hell didn't we have those things? Well, and in due consideration of that committee, they were really being twisted by the group that governs them, the pilot MEC. I have been to a lot of meetings in my day, and I've never seen anything as emotional as that meeting in my entire life. I can't even describe in words the high level of emotion that was in that room. Careers were on the line, and not just a few careers. We're talking 4,000 careers, and we're talking careers that span 30 years. That's 120,000 career years you're dealing with in there, and a great deal of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, and all being left to rapid decision making by 27 people who were going to have to really take some heat. Decisions to take away things like membership ratification. It had to be done quickly, so they couldn't have it membership ratified. Later, that got thrust back in their face that the flight attendants did membership ratify. And the pilot, why didn't we
have
adding more? At the very, very end, though, the people that were in favor of accepting a lower wage scale and so forth prevailed, and there was a tremendous amount of animosity later in backlash that the airline wouldn't have been sold had they come to an agreement more quickly. The feeling was that, and I can understand the other side too. I don't know Charlie Bryan all that well, but I have to suspect that in his mind was this feeling that we're being set up for a massive trap here. It's there's a term for a chess move that you're in an unextractable position. No matter how you move, you're dead. And it's a real pincer play, and the choices were cancer, leukemia, or polio. I mean, pick one. You want to take a 20% wage cut? Do you want your airline sold to Frank Lorenzo? Or would you like to go bankrupt? Here's our menu. Pick one. None of those were very palatable choices. And I guess in Mr. Bryan's case, he just felt that this was a bluff. If they weren't any more going to sell this airline, then send Frank back to the moon. So if I just sit here, it'll all go away. The other groups will give enough to keep this thing floating, and I can just sit here and watch it. And he was wrong. And I'm not. He had a decision to make. I wasn't in his shoes. I don't know what his membership was saying. So I don't agree with his decision, but I can't fault him for having to make it, and he did. I credit him for making the decision. It's better than some people who would just sit and,
don't make any, right?
Yeah, just sit there in anguish for days, and he made his decision. And it was unfortunate, the outcome, but there was, as far as the pilots were concerned, in answer to your direct question, there was just a tremendous amount of hostility, even physical hostility between some of them at the conclusion. And there's still, it lingers. The aftermath has been rough. One of the representatives from one of the larger bases was recalled for his actions. Just an incredible recall ratio. Another one quit in a large base. The second officer just quit. He was so upset that the others couldn't see his position. Both of these gentlemen were in the minority. A third has advised me confidentially of the 7 people that were opposed to this. The third one has advised me that he intends to resign as soon as things cool down. He's frustrated with the whole process. A tremendous toll taken on these people. It's been difficult.
You have an appointment, so I won't keep you any longer.
Okay.
Can we talk more?
Sure.
At some point? Okay.
Yeah. If you'd like to go back, as far as if you want to focus more on those events that transpired, what I probably should do is have my tape, get a transcript made here at ALPA, just a rough one. I'll look through it. I know when I made it, there were some things that I thought about later that maybe I had misstated, and I'd like to see the transcript myself.
Okay. So after you have that done, then maybe we can talk further?
We'll talk again.
Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
You're surely welcome.